The Serenity's edge drifted silently through the Kepler 442 system, its sleek hull reflecting the amber light of the distant star like a metallic predator stalking through cosmic waters. Captain Marcus Kane stood on the bridge, his weathered hands clasped behind his back, as he watched the alien vessel approach through the reinforced viewport. The ship had been humanity's home for 8 months now. 8 months of careful, painstaking communication through mathematical sequences, prime numbers, and increasingly complex pictographs that had finally led to this moment. Atmospheric composition confirmed, Captain, reported Lieutenant Maria Rodriguez from the science station, her voice betraying barely contained excitement. Oxygen-nitrogen mix, 23% oxygen versus Earth's 21%. Slightly higher CO2 concentration, but well within human physiological tolerance. Temperature stable at 22 degrees Celsius. Kane nodded, his fingers automatically adjusting the collar of his dress uniform. The formal navy blue with gold braiding that the United Earth Coalition had designated for first contact protocols. Every detail had been planned, rehearsed, and analyzed by teams of xenopsychologists, linguists, and diplomats back on Earth. The weight of representing not just his ship, not just his nation, but his entire species pressed down on his shoulders like a physical force. "How's our translation matrix holding up, Dr. Hawthorne?" Kane asked, turning to the tall, auburn-haired woman standing beside him. Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne was arguably Earth's leading xenobiologist, though until today, that had been a purely theoretical title. Her translation device, a marvel of quantum computing and linguistic algorithms, hummed quietly at her side. "All systems nominal, Captain," she replied, checking her readings one final time. The device has processed over 3,000 hours of their mathematical and pictographic communications. If there's any way to bridge our communication gap, this should do it. Commander James Fletcher maintained a respectful distance near the bridge's tactical station, his trained eye constantly assessing potential threats while trying to appear non-threatening himself. The security detail under his command had been chosen specifically for their ability to appear both professional and non-aggressive. First contact protocols emphasized that humanity needed to make the right first impression. Through the viewport, the alien vessel grew larger as it approached. Kane had seen the initial sensor readings, but witnessing it directly still took his breath away. The ship was a marvel of organic architecture, flowing curves and undulating surfaces that seemed more grown than built. Bioluminescent panels pulsed in slow, rhythmic patterns along its hull like the heartbeat of some massive creature. Nothing about its design resembled the angular, utilitarian aesthetics that humans preferred. Where human ships looked like tools, this vessel looked alive. "Docking sequence initiated," reported the navigation officer. "Their ship's interface is unusual, sir. It's almost like it's learning our docking protocols in real time and adapting to match them." Kane felt his pulse quicken, not from fear, but from the profound excitement of the moment. Humanity had dreamed of this day since the first human looked up at the stars and wondered if they were alone. The answer was approaching at 12 meters per second, requesting permission to come aboard. The airlock cycling process seemed to take forever. Kane could hear the mechanical sounds of pressure equalization, atmospheric mixing, and safety protocols engaging. The ship's computer announced each step in its calm, electronic voice. Atmospheric match achieved. Pressure equalization complete. Biological contamination screens negative. First contact protocols active. Then, finally, the inner airlock door hissed open. The first alien to emerge moved with a grace that immediately marked it as something far removed from Earth's evolutionary tree. It stood roughly 7 feet tall, with translucent, pearl-colored skin that seemed to shift and shimmer in the bridge's lighting. For arms extended from its torso, not the bilateral symmetry that dominated Earth biology, but something altogether more elegant and functional. Its head was elongated, housing large, dark eyes that held depths Kane had never seen in any terrestrial creature. Those eyes seemed to take in everything at once. The bridge layout, the human crew positions, the technological displays, all processed with an intelligence that felt both ancient and utterly alien. Behind the first alien came 2 others of similar appearance, though Kane noted subtle differences in their skin patterns and the way they moved. Each carried what appeared to be some form of portable technology, devices that pulsed with the same bioluminescent patterns as their ship. Kane stepped forward, his heart hammering against his ribs. History pivoted on this moment. "Welcome aboard the Serenity's Edge," he said slowly and clearly, activating the universal translator with a subtle hand gesture. "I am Captain Marcus Kane, representing the United Earth Coalition and, through it, the human species." The response came after a brief pause, during which Kane could see the aliens' devices flickering with increased activity. When the lead alien spoke, its voice emerged through the translator as something melodic and layered, like a symphony compressed into speech patterns. "Greetings, Captain Kane of the species human." The translation rendered. "I am Counselor HFY of the Etherian Collective. We extend harmonious frequencies to you and your crew. We are honored by this historic convergence of consciousness." The slight pause before "honored" suggested the translator was struggling with concepts that didn't translate directly, but Kane felt a surge of profound relief. Communication was possible. Dr. Hawthorne stepped forward, her scientific instruments discreetly recording everything: biological readings, linguistic patterns, environmental data that would be analyzed for decades to come. "Counselor HFY," she said carefully, "in your initial transmissions, you mentioned that the Etherian Collective represents multiple species. Are you part of a larger galactic community?" The alien's large eyes seemed to focus on her with increased intensity. "Indeed, Dr. Hawthorne. We represent 17 peaceful species united in scientific advancement, cultural exchange, and harmonious coexistence. We have observed your species' rapid technological development over recent cycles and wish to extend an invitation for humanity to join our collective consciousness." Kane felt the blood rush to his head. This was beyond humanity's wildest dreams. Not just first contact, but an invitation to join an established galactic civilization. The implications were staggering. "We would be deeply honored to learn more about this possibility," Kane replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Perhaps we could begin with a cultural exchange? We've prepared demonstrations of human achievements in art, science, philosophy, and our understanding of the universe." The three aliens exchanged what Kane interpreted as glances, though their large, unblinking eyes made it difficult to be certain. He noticed their bioluminescent skin patterns shifting slightly, perhaps some form of nonverbal communication. "That would be most enlightening," HFY responded, though Kane caught something in the translator's rendering that suggested reservation, or perhaps caution. "We are eager to understand the nature of human consciousness and achievement." The ship's main conference room had undergone a complete transformation over the past 6 hours. What was normally a sterile meeting space with standard-issue gray walls and utilitarian furniture had been converted into humanity's most ambitious exhibition hall. Holographic projectors lined every surface, their quantum processors working overtime to render humanity's greatest achievements in stunning three-dimensional detail. The centerpiece display dominated the room's center, a slowly rotating representation of Earth itself, but not as it appeared from space. Instead, this was Earth as humanity had shaped it. Cities gleaming like jewels against the darkness, orbital stations forming delicate webs around the planet, the Mars colonies visible as distant points of light, and the massive construction yards where humanity's first generation of FTL vessels took shape. Surrounding this central display, smaller projections showcased the breadth of human achievement. The Sistine Chapel's ceiling appeared in perfect detail, every brushstroke of Michelangelo's genius preserved in quantum resolution. Nearby, Einstein's equations hung in the air like poetry written in mathematics, the elegant simplicity of E=mc² glowing softly beside more complex formulations that had unlocked faster-than-light travel. Musical compositions by Beethoven, Mozart, and modern synthesists created a subtle auditory backdrop. Not intrusive, but present enough to demonstrate humanity's relationship with sound and rhythm. The three Etherians moved through the displays with what Kane was learning to recognize as their species' equivalent of wonder. Their forearms gestured gracefully as they absorbed each piece of information, and Kane noticed their bioluminescent skin patterns shifting continuously, perhaps some form of emotional response or internal communication. Your species demonstrates remarkable creative synthesis, HFY observed, pausing before a holographic representation of Van Gogh's Starry Night. The alien extended one arm toward the swirling patterns of paint, stopping just short of touching the projection. This emotional expression through visual medium, it resonates with frequencies we associate with deep contemplation and temporal reflection. Lieutenant Rodriguez, who had been discreetly monitoring the alien's biological responses with her handheld scanner, leaned closer to Dr. Hawthorne. Their electromagnetic signatures are spiking every time they view our artistic works, she whispered. It's like they're experiencing some kind of synesthetic response. Their brains are literally lighting up in patterns I've never seen before. Kane felt a surge of pride at their guest's obvious appreciation. We're deeply pleased that our cultural expressions resonate with you. Perhaps you could share some examples of Etherian artistic achievement? We're eager to understand how your species approaches creativity and cultural expression. The three aliens exchanged those subtle glances again. A quick shift of their large, dark eyes that Kane was beginning to recognize as their version of consultation. HFY produced what appeared to be a crystalline device from somewhere within its flowing garments, its surface covered in the same bioluminescent patterns that decorated their skin. When activated, the device filled the room with something that transcended simple audiovisual display. Swirling patterns of light and sound merged into something that seemed to bypass the human sensory organs entirely and speak directly to their consciousness. The display told stories without words, tales of peace, harmony, and unity among the stars. Kane watched, mesmerized, as civilizations rose and fell in the space of heartbeats, as species met and joined in perfect understanding, as conflicts dissolved into mutual cooperation through patient dialogue and shared wisdom. Extraordinary, Dr. Hawthorne breathed, her scientific instruments working frantically to record and analyze what they were witnessing. It's like pure emotion given form and substance. How is this possible? This is how we communicate complex philosophical and cultural concepts, HFY explained, its melodic voice carrying new harmonics that the translator struggled to render. We have transcended the need for crude linguistic approximations or primitive symbolic representations. Through unity of consciousness and shared emotional resonance, we have achieved perfect harmony in expression. Commander Fletcher shifted almost imperceptibly, but Kane caught the subtle movement. His security chief's trained instincts were always active, and something in the alien's presentation seemed to have triggered his attention. Kane made a mental note to debrief with Fletcher privately later. Counselor HFY, Kane said carefully, you mentioned transcending certain needs and achieving harmony. In your experience with other species, what stages do civilizations typically pass through in their development? The alien's large eyes focused on Kane with what seemed like increased intensity, and its bioluminescent patterns shifted to configurations Kane hadn't seen before. Deeper blues mixed with silver highlights. Most species follow predictable developmental patterns, HFY replied, its translator taking slightly longer than usual to process the concepts. They begin with territorial instincts, resource competition, and predator-prey dynamics that govern their early evolution. As their intelligence expands and their consciousness matures, they gradually shed these primitive behaviors. The truly advanced species, those we invite into our collective, have moved completely beyond all forms of violence, aggression, and competitive instincts. Dr. Hawthorne nodded thoughtfully, her scientific background making the progression seem logical. That makes perfect sense from an evolutionary perspective. As intelligence increases and technology advances, the need for physical conflict and competitive behaviors should naturally decrease. Precisely, HFY agreed, though Kane detected something in its tone that hadn't been there before, a subtle undertone that the translator rendered as mild concern. We have observed across hundreds of species that those who cling to their predatory heritage or competitive instincts rarely achieve the technological sophistication necessary for sustainable interstellar travel. They typically destroy themselves or stagnate before reaching true advancement. It is unusual, that humans appear to have managed both technological progress and retained certain primitive characteristics. Kane felt a small chill run down his spine at the alien's tone, but he forced himself to push the feeling aside. This exchange was proceeding better than anyone had dared hope back on Earth. The possibility of joining a galactic civilization was within humanity's grasp. We've certainly had our share of conflicts throughout our history, Kane admitted, choosing his words carefully. But we've learned to work together when it truly matters. Our colonies, our FTL breakthrough, our unified response to first contact. These achievements required unprecedented cooperation across all human cultures and nations. Yes, HFY said slowly, its bioluminescent patterns shifting again to combinations Kane couldn't interpret. We are most curious about this apparent contradiction in your species' development. The way it said curious made Kane wonder if something important was being lost in translation. The ship's medical bay hummed with an energy that Dr. Elizabeth Hawthorne had never experienced before. Banks of sophisticated sensors lined the walls, their displays flickering with data streams that would revolutionize xenobiology for generations to come. She had been granted an unprecedented opportunity, the chance to conduct basic biological scans of the Etherians in exchange for allowing them to study human physiology. The mutual scientific exchange had been HFY's suggestion, presented as a gesture of good faith between their species. This is absolutely extraordinary, Dr. Hawthorne murmured, her eyes fixed on the cascading data from her quantum bioscanner. Your cellular structure is unlike anything in Earth's evolutionary tree, nothing even remotely similar. It's as if your species developed along entirely different biological principles from the ground up. The Etherian researcher who had introduced itself as Veltar stood motionless under the scanning array, its four arms spread in a gesture that seemed to indicate cooperation. Its bioluminescent skin patterns pulsed in slow, rhythmic waves. What Dr. Hawthorne was beginning to suspect was their species' equivalent of calm breathing. We find this exchange equally fascinating, Veltar responded through its translator, the device's harmonics creating an almost musical quality to its speech. Your biological architecture follows pathways we have not encountered in our extensive travels through the galaxy. Dr. Hawthorne adjusted her scanner's parameters, diving deeper into the alien's physiology. Tell me about your evolutionary history, if you don't mind. Your cellular structure suggests a completely different approach to life itself. We evolved from organisms that fed on ambient energy and trace minerals, Veltar explained, its large eyes tracking the human doctor's movements with obvious interest. Our homeworld's primary star provided abundant energy for all life forms. Competition for resources was minimal, as our sun's radiation spectrum contained frequencies that our ancestors could convert directly into usable biological energy. Photosynthesis, Dr. Hawthorne asked, then immediately corrected herself. No, wait, this is something more sophisticated. You're talking about direct energy conversion at the cellular level. Indeed, the concept of one organism consuming another for survival is... Veltar paused, its translator working longer than usual to find appropriate terms. It is difficult for us to fully comprehend, though we have observed such behaviors in younger evolutionary systems. Dr. Hawthorne's scanner beeped softly as it completed another pass. So no predation in your evolutionary history whatsoever? No competition for resources, no survival pressures that would drive aggressive behaviors? None, Veltar confirmed, its skin patterns shifting to what Dr. Hawthorne was learning to recognize as emphasis or certainty. Our development followed cooperative principles from the earliest stages. Organisms that worked together thrived, while those that competed simply failed to propagate efficiently. Lieutenant Rodriguez, monitoring the session from the medical bay's control station, noted several fascinating physiological responses from both species. Doc, she whispered through the comm system, their electromagnetic fields fluctuate in distinct patterns whenever we mention concepts like conflict, competition, or predation. It's almost like these ideas cause them actual physical discomfort. On the other side of the medical bay, Captain Kane had volunteered as the human test subject for the aliens' examination. Veltar's scanning equipment was a marvel of biotechnology. organic-looking devices that seemed to grow and adapt their scanning parameters in real time, responding to what they discovered about human physiology. Your skeletal structure is remarkably dense, Veltar observed, its 4 arms moving over various scanner readings with practiced efficiency. These bone formations appear designed for high-impact resistance and rapid force generation. And these muscle fiber configurations. The alien paused, its bioluminescent patterns shifting to colors Dr. Hawthorne hadn't seen before. They appear optimized for explosive movement and sustained physical exertion. Humans evolved as persistence hunters, Dr. Hawthorne explained from across the room, simultaneously monitoring both examinations. Our ancestors could pursue prey across vast distances, wearing them down through superior endurance. We're built for both marathon running and sudden bursts of explosive activity. She noticed Veltar's translator pause for several seconds longer than usual before rendering this explanation into Etherian communication patterns. When it finally spoke, there was something different in its harmonic frequencies. Pursuit of prey, Veltar repeated slowly. Your species engaged in active hunting of other organisms? For millions of years, Kane confirmed, noting the alien's obvious discomfort with the concept. Though we've long since moved beyond subsistence hunting, the biological adaptations remain. Veltar's scanning device moved to focus on Kane's head, its organic sensors extending with almost cautious movements. These optical organs are particularly intriguing. The pupil apertures expand and contract significantly, far more than would be necessary for simple light regulation. What triggers these changes? Dr. Hawthorne pulled up a holographic display showing human eye anatomy and function. Light levels are the primary factor, but pupil dilation also responds to emotional states, cognitive focus, physical arousal, and... She hesitated, considering her words carefully. Various forms of excitement or stress response. All 4 of Veltar's arms had gone completely still. Stress response. Fight or flight reactions, Dr. Hawthorne continued, unaware of the alien's increasing agitation. When humans encounter potential threats or high-stress situations, our sympathetic nervous system triggers a cascade of physiological changes. Increased heart rate, elevated blood pressure, enhanced sensory acuity, pupil dilation, all designed to prepare the body for intense physical activity. Kane noticed the alien had taken a step back from the scanning equipment. Is something wrong? Veltar's bioluminescent patterns were now cycling through rapid color changes that Dr. Hawthorne was beginning to associate with extreme agitation or fear. These preparations, they occur in peaceful situations as well? The responses are somewhat diminished in modern humans, Kane explained, trying to sound reassuring. But yes, the biological mechanisms remain active. It's mostly vestigial now. Evolutionary holdovers from our more primitive past. But they still function, Veltar pressed, its translator struggling with harmonic frequencies that seemed to indicate barely controlled panic. Your species maintains active biological preparations for violence even during peaceful interactions? Dr. Hawthorne looked up from her own scanning, suddenly aware that something significant was happening. Veltar's electromagnetic readings were spiking erratically, and its skin patterns had shifted to deep purples and stark whites, colors she'd never observed before. They're largely unconscious responses, she said carefully. Modern humans have learned to control and override these instincts through cultural development and rational thought. But even as she spoke the words, Dr. Hawthorne realized how they might sound to a species that had never experienced predation, competition, or the biological imperative to hunt and kill for survival. To the Etherians, humans weren't just different, they were something far more disturbing. They were a species that had retained the biological capacity for violence while gaining the technological sophistication to make that violence truly dangerous. Veltar had taken several more steps backward, its 4 arms now held in unmistakably defensive positions. When it spoke again, its words carried harmonics that the translator could barely process. You are still armed. Even in peace, your bodies remain weapons. The cultural exchange had been proceeding with remarkable smoothness for nearly 6 hours when the universe decided to test humanity's first contact protocols in the most dramatic way possible. Dr. Hawthorne was in the middle of demonstrating advanced human laboratory techniques to the Etherian researchers, her hands moving with practiced precision as she explained the intricacies of quantum-enhanced molecular analysis. The beauty of this system, she was saying, adjusting the calibration on a particularly sophisticated piece of equipment, is that it allows us to examine biological samples at the subatomic level while maintaining their structural integrity. We can literally watch DNA repair itself in real time. Veltar and its 2 companions observed with obvious fascination, their bioluminescent skin patterns pulsing in synchronized waves that Dr. Hawthorne had learned indicated intense scientific curiosity. The aliens' own scanning devices worked in harmony with the human equipment, creating an unprecedented fusion of technologies that would have made xenobiologists back on Earth weep with joy. The disaster began with something as mundane as a power fluctuation. Deep in the ship's secondary laboratory bay, a containment unit that had been operating flawlessly for 8 months suddenly experienced a cascade failure in its quantum containment matrix. The unit housed biological samples from dozens of worlds, tissue specimens, microorganisms, genetic material, and other biological curiosities that the Serenity's Edge had collected during its long journey to this historic meeting. The alert klaxon's piercing wail shattered the peaceful atmosphere of scientific cooperation. Emergency lighting bathed the corridors in angry red as the ship's AI announced in its calm, electronic voice. Attention all personnel. Level 3 biological containment breach in Laboratory Bay 7. All personnel maintain current positions pending hazmat assessment. This is not a drill. Dr. Hawthorne's blood ran cold. Laboratory Bay 7 was directly adjacent to their current location, separated by nothing more than a single bulkhead and the ship's atmospheric recycling system. Captain Kane's voice crackled over the comm system. Dr. Hawthorne, report to Lab 7 immediately. Commander Fletcher, initiate emergency protocols. Kane arrived at the laboratory to find controlled chaos. Emergency response teams in full hazmat gear were sealing off contaminated sections while Dr. Hawthorne worked frantically at a portable scanner, her face grim behind her emergency respirator. Status report, Doctor, Kane demanded, his own breathing apparatus making his voice sound mechanical and distorted. We've got a complete failure of Containment Unit 7 Alpha, Dr. Hawthorne replied, not looking up from her readings. The quantum matrix destabilized and released the contents of at least 15 different sample containers before the emergency seals could activate. Kane felt his stomach drop. What kind of samples are we talking about? Everything from harmless atmospheric bacteria to potentially dangerous microorganisms we collected from hostile environments. We won't know the full scope until we can complete a comprehensive analysis, but... She paused, her scanner beeping ominously. Captain, this is bad. The 3 Etherian visitors had followed Kane to the laboratory despite protocols suggesting they should remain in the conference room. They stood near the entrance, their large eyes taking in the scene of human emergency response with what Kane was beginning to recognize as deep concern. Is there immediate danger to biological entities in this vicinity? HFY asked through its translator, the device struggling to render what were obviously complex emotional harmonics. Potentially, Kane replied with characteristic honesty. We're implementing full quarantine procedures until we can identify and neutralize any potential threats to both our species. Dr. Hawthorne continued her methodical scanning of the contaminated area, moving through the laboratory with the practiced efficiency of someone who had dealt with biological hazards before. Her instruments painted a grim picture of the contamination scope. Atmospheric contamination had spread beyond the immediate area before the emergency systems could contain it. Captain, she called out, her voice carrying a note of something that made Kane's pulse quicken. I'm reading organic compounds consistent with hemoglobin analogs. Multiple varieties. Kane felt his jaw clench involuntarily. Hemoglobin? You mean blood samples? Affirmative. One of the compromised containers held blood samples from the Kepler 438 expedition. Her voice carried the weight of memory. The Kepler 438 mission had been a disaster where the landing team had encountered a hostile environment that had claimed 3 lives. Those blood samples represented the last physical remains of Lieutenant Commander Sarah Mitchell, Chief Petty Officer David Park, and xenobiologist Maria Santos. Kane closed his eyes briefly, remembering 3 good people who had died in service of humanity's expansion to the stars. How extensive is the contamination? Significant. The samples underwent rapid oxidation when they contacted the ship's atmosphere. We're looking at aerosolized blood compounds distributed throughout the entire laboratory section. As Dr. Hawthorne spoke, Kane became acutely aware of a metallic scent beginning to penetrate even his emergency respirator's filters. That distinctive copper smell of oxidized blood, a scent that any human would recognize instantly, buried deep in genetic memory from millions of years of evolution. The smell triggered something immediate and undeniable in Kane's physiology. His heart rate accelerated, pupils dilated, and muscles tensed in preparation for what? There was no threat here, no enemy to fight, no prey to hunt. But his body didn't distinguish between rational understanding and evolutionary programming. He felt the familiar sensation of heightened awareness flooding his system, every detail of his environment becoming sharper, more immediate. The sound of his crew's breathing, the subtle movements of the Etherians near the doorway, the specific pattern of emergency lighting reflecting off metallic surfaces. It was just a physiological response to stress and the scent of blood. Nothing more than evolutionary programming that modern humans had learned to control and channel constructively. But when he glanced toward the Etherians to reassure them that the situation was under control, Kane saw something that made his enhanced awareness spike into genuine alarm. All 3 aliens had gone completely motionless. Not the fluid stillness they had displayed during their cultural exchange, but the frozen rigidity of prey animals that had suddenly detected the presence of a predator. Their large, dark eyes were fixed directly on him with an intensity that seemed to pierce through his soul, and their bioluminescent skin patterns had shifted to colors Kane had never seen before. Deep purples and stark whites pulsed across their translucent skin in rapid, erratic patterns that spoke of primal terror. Veltar's 4 arms were held rigidly at its sides, and all 3 aliens seemed to have stopped breathing entirely. "Captain," Dr. Hawthorne whispered urgently. Her own scanner now pointed not at the contamination but at the Etherians. "Their electromagnetic signatures just spiked beyond anything I've recorded. They're exhibiting what can only be described as extreme fear responses, fight or flight activation across all their biological systems." Kane tried to speak, to move slowly and reassuringly, to explain that everything was under control. But before he could form the words, HFY's translator crackled with a single word that cut through the laboratory's emergency lighting like a blade. "Predator." The word hung in the air with the weight of absolute recognition, of ancient fears made manifest, of the moment when prey finally understands that it has been sharing space with something that could kill and consume it without a second thought. And in that terrible moment of clarity, Kane realized that humanity's first contact had just taken a turn that no protocol had ever anticipated. As Dr. Hawthorne spoke, Kane became acutely aware of a metallic scent beginning to penetrate even his emergency respirator's filters. That distinctive copper smell of oxidized blood, a scent that any human would recognize instantly, buried deep in genetic memory from millions of years of evolution. The smell triggered something immediate and undeniable in Kane's physiology. His heart rate accelerated, pupils dilated, and muscles tensed in preparation for what? There was no threat here, no enemy to fight, no prey to hunt. But his body didn't distinguish between rational understanding and evolutionary programming. He felt the familiar sensation of heightened awareness flooding his system, every detail of his environment becoming sharper, more immediate. The sound of his crew's breathing, the subtle movements of the Etherians near the doorway, the specific pattern of emergency lighting reflecting off metallic surfaces. It was just a physiological response to stress and the scent of blood. Nothing more than evolutionary programming that modern humans had learned to control and channel constructively. But when he glanced toward the Etherians to reassure them that the situation was under control, Kane saw something that made his enhanced awareness spike into genuine alarm. All 3 aliens had gone completely motionless. Not the fluid stillness they had displayed during their cultural exchange, but the frozen rigidity of prey animals that had suddenly detected the presence of a predator. Their large, dark eyes were fixed directly on him with an intensity that seemed to pierce through his soul, and their bioluminescent skin patterns had shifted to colors Kane had never seen before. Deep purples and stark whites pulsed across their translucent skin in rapid, erratic patterns that spoke of primal terror. Veltar's four arms were held rigidly at its sides, and all three aliens seemed to have stopped breathing entirely. "Captain," Dr. Hawthorne whispered urgently. Her own scanner now pointed not at the contamination but at the Etherians. "Their electromagnetic signatures just spiked beyond anything I've recorded. They're exhibiting what can only be described as extreme fear responses, fight or flight activation across all their biological systems." Kane tried to speak, to move slowly and reassuringly, to explain that everything was under control. But before he could form the words, HFY's translator crackled with a single word that cut through the laboratory's emergency lighting like a blade. "Predator." The word hung in the air with the weight of absolute recognition, of ancient fears made manifest, of the moment when prey finally understands that it has been sharing space with something that could kill and consume it without a second thought. And in that terrible moment of clarity, Kane realized that humanity's first contact had just taken a turn that no protocol had ever anticipated. The laboratory fell into an eerie silence that seemed to stretch for eternity, broken only by the mechanical hum of air recyclers working desperately to clear the contamination and the subtle electronic beeping of monitoring equipment. The emergency lighting cast everything in harsh red shadows, transforming the familiar scientific workspace into something that resembled a scene from humanity's darkest nightmares. Kane stood frozen in the crimson-tinted atmosphere, acutely aware that any sudden movement might trigger an irreversible cascade of fear in the three alien visitors. But his body betrayed him anyway. His enhanced awareness was cataloging every detail of the scene with predatory precision. The way Veltar's four arms trembled almost imperceptibly. The rapid, shallow breathing patterns of all three Etherians. The specific electromagnetic frequencies their panic was generating, frequencies that his heightened senses could somehow detect without his scanner. "Dr." Hawthorne's voice was barely above a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile stability remained in the situation. "Captain, their stress hormones, or whatever biochemical equivalent they possess, have flooded their circulatory systems, and they're releasing chemical signals into the atmosphere. Pheromones, possibly, but unlike anything in our xenobiological databases. The readings on her scanner were unlike anything she had ever recorded. The Etherian's bioluminescent skin patterns were now pulsing in what could only be described as a synchronized panic response. Deep purples and stark whites racing across their translucent flesh in patterns that spoke of terror so profound it transcended species barriers. Veltar made a sound that the universal translator couldn't begin to process. A high, keening frequency that seemed to resonate in Kane's bones and trigger something primal in his own nervous system. It was the sound of prey that had finally recognized its predator, the vocalization of a creature that understood its own mortality with crystal clarity. "Easy," Kane said softly, his voice carefully modulated to the tone he might use with a frightened animal. Low, non-threatening, designed to soothe rather than alarm. "Nobody's in danger here. We're just dealing with a standard containment breach. This is a medical emergency, not a threat situation." But even as he spoke these reasonable words, Kane could feel his own physiology continuing to respond to stimuli beyond his conscious control. The metallic scent of aerosolized blood seemed to intensify with each breath, triggering cascading responses that millions of years of evolution had hardwired into his DNA. His pupils remained dilated despite the emergency lighting. His stance had unconsciously shifted to a more balanced, ready position, and his awareness had expanded to encompass every potential threat and opportunity in his environment. Dr. Hawthorne, monitoring both species simultaneously with her advanced scanners, provided a running commentary that made the situation increasingly surreal. "Captain, your adrenaline levels just doubled when I mentioned the blood samples. Heart rate up 30%, muscle tension increasing, and your brain activity is showing patterns I've only seen during combat simulations." Kane shot her a warning look that said, "Not helping." But the damage was already done. The Ethereans' fear seemed to deepen exponentially with each piece of biological data that confirmed their worst suspicions. HFY's translator finally found its electronic voice, though the harmonic frequencies underlying its words spoke of barely controlled terror. The optical dilation patterns, the postural adjustments, the electromagnetic signatures radiating from your neural pathways. You are experiencing what our archives describe as hunting arousal. No, Kane said firmly, though he realized how his denial might sound to beings whose entire evolutionary history had never included predation. This is a stress response to a dangerous situation. Humans react this way to potential hazards. It's a survival mechanism, not an aggressive one. But the blood scent triggers it more intensely, Dr. Hawthorne observed with clinical detachment, still monitoring her readings with scientific fascination despite the deteriorating diplomatic situation. Captain, when I specifically mentioned the hemoglobin analogs, your physiological responses intensified by a factor of 3. Kane realized with growing horror that every word of scientific explanation was making things worse. To the Ethereans, human biology wasn't just different, it was the stuff of their species' oldest nightmares. Veltar spoke in rapid, musical tones that the translator struggled desperately to render into human language. The old stories, the warnings passed down through 8,000 cycles of the collective species that evolved from the consumption of other life, we believed they were merely cautionary myths designed to teach wisdom to the young. What warnings? Kane asked, though a growing part of him suspected he didn't want to know the answer. The way the 3 aliens were looking at him, with the fixed, unblinking attention of prey animals that had finally spotted the predator in their midst, told him that whatever these stories contained, they didn't end well for anyone. HFY's voice took on an almost ritualistic quality through the translator, as if it were reciting ancient texts that had been memorized and passed down through countless generations. Beings who carry the killing hunger in their blood plasma, who grow more dangerous and focused in the presence of prey scent, who display the ancient neural patterns and physiological markers of the hunting kind, the consumers, the destroyers, the species that feed on the life force of others. Dr. Hawthorne looked between Kane and the aliens, her scientific mind racing to process the implications of what she was hearing. You're talking about predator species in general or something more specific? Surely in your extensive galactic travels, you've encountered other evolved predators who achieved technological sophistication. Never, HFY replied, and there was absolute certainty in its harmonic frequencies that brooked no argument. The collective has existed for 8,000 standard orbital cycles. We have initiated contact protocols with over 300 distinct species across 17 different galactic sectors. Those few that retained strong predatory instincts or hunting behaviors never achieved the technological sophistication necessary for interstellar travel. They invariably destroyed themselves through internal warfare before reaching true advancement. The implications hit Kane like a physical blow to his chest. You're saying we're unique in the galaxy? Uniquely dangerous, Veltar added, its 4 arms now held in what was unmistakably a defensive posture, as if preparing to flee or protect itself from an imminent attack. A species that retained the killer's instincts while simultaneously developing the killer's tools. A contradiction that should not be possible according to all our models of civilization development. Commander Fletcher's voice crackled over the comm system. Captain, we've sealed the contamination and initiated atmospheric purification. Are you and the diplomatic team secure? Kane looked at the 3 terrified aliens, their bioluminescent skin patterns now showing what he was beginning to recognize as the Etherian equivalent of a full panic attack, and realized that everything had fundamentally changed. The historic first contact that was supposed to herald humanity's entry into a galactic civilization had instead triggered the deepest fears of a species that had spent millennia learning to recognize the signs of ultimate danger. We're physically secure, Commander, Kane replied carefully, choosing his words with the precision of a diplomat walking through a minefield. But I think we need to have a much more comprehensive conversation with our guests about galactic history and species development patterns. The ship's main conference room felt fundamentally different now, as if the very molecules in the air had been charged with an electric tension that made breathing feel laborious. where mere hours before it had been a place of excitement, discovery, and unprecedented diplomatic triumph. The space now felt like a courtroom where humanity itself sat in the defendant's chair, awaiting judgment from judges whose verdict might already be decided. The Etherians had arranged themselves, or rather, positioned themselves in their species' equivalent of sitting, as far from the humans as the room's physical dimensions would allow. Their bioluminescent skin patterns had shifted to configurations that Dr. Hawthorne was learning to read like an emotional barometer. Muted blues and grays that seemed to absorb light rather than emit it, punctuated by occasional flashes of deep purple that she suspected indicated ongoing stress or fear. Captain Kane had dismissed all but essential personnel from this emergency session. Only Dr. Hawthorne and Commander Fletcher remained, and even Fletcher had positioned himself near the door at Kane's subtle but unmistakable gesture, ready to respond to threats from either direction, whether they came from outside the room or from within it. The silence stretched for nearly a full minute before Kane finally broke it, his voice carefully modulated to project calm authority despite the circumstances. "Tell us about these stories, Counselor HFY. The warnings you mentioned. We need to understand what we're dealing with." HFY's bioluminescent patterns had shifted to what Dr. Hawthorne was beginning to recognize as deep unease, colors that seemed to draw light into themselves rather than reflecting it back, creating an almost light-absorbing effect that made the alien appear to fade into the shadows of the room. In the early developmental cycles of the collective, HFY began through the translator, its harmonic frequencies carrying undertones that spoke of ancient pain. We were fewer in number, more naive in our understanding of the galaxy's darker possibilities. We believed, with the certainty of youth and inexperience, that intelligence naturally led to peace, that any species capable of achieving interstellar travel would have necessarily abandoned the primitive drives and violent instincts of their evolutionary origins. The alien paused, its large eyes reflecting the room's lights like dark mirrors that seemed to hold depths of memory and regret. When it continued, its voice carried the weight of hard-learned lessons and species-wide trauma. "We encountered 3 species over the course of our expansion that proved us catastrophically wrong. 3 species that taught us that intelligence and civilization do not automatically eliminate the predator's heart." Dr. Hawthorne leaned forward despite herself, her scientific curiosity warring with growing dread. "What happened to them? How did first contact proceed?" Veltar answered, its 4 arms moving in what Kane was learning to recognize as gestures of mourning or remembrance. "The first called themselves the Rakshari. Like your species, they had evolved from persistence hunters on a world where survival demanded the ability to track, pursue, and kill other organisms for sustenance. They seemed peaceful at first contact, eager to learn, genuinely excited to join our collective knowledge base and contribute to galactic civilization." Kane felt a chill run down his spine at the parallel. But within one standard orbital cycle of formal contact, they had systematically studied our defensive capabilities, mapped our trade routes with mathematical precision, learned the locations of our colony worlds, and identified the specific weaknesses in our collective security infrastructure. HFY continued, its bioluminescent patterns now pulsing with what could only be described as remembered terror. "They used the information against you," Kane stated, though it wasn't really a question. 17 colony worlds fell before we fully understood what was happening. Veltar interjected, its voice carrying harmonics that the translator rendered as mourning, but which contained depths of grief that no translation could fully capture. "They didn't destroy randomly or waste resources through inefficient violence. They were surgical in their approach, efficient in their methodology. They took what they needed and left the populations alive but broken, leaderless, stripped of everything that made resistance possible." Dr. Hawthorne felt her scientific worldview shifting uncomfortably. "They conquered rather than destroyed? Conquest implies some form of ongoing governance or administration," HFY replied. "This was more like harvesting. They took resources, technology, genetic material for their research, and then moved on to the next target, leaving behind populations that were physically intact but psychologically and culturally devastated." Commander Fletcher spoke for the first time since entering the room, his voice carrying the professional tone of someone who understood military strategy. "You mentioned 3 species. What about the second?" The alien skin patterns shifted again, this time to colors that Dr. Hawthorne had never observed before. Deep reds mixed with stark blacks that created an almost warning-like appearance. The second species, the Vorthak, were more direct in their approach to violence. HFY continued. They had evolved from pack hunters, creatures that worked together to bring down prey much larger than themselves. When resources grew scarce in their home system due to overpopulation and environmental degradation, they turned to raiding as a solution to their survival needs. Kane's jaw tightened. Raiding other species? Initially, yes, we tried to offer them uninhabited worlds suitable for colonization, resource-sharing agreements that would have solved their scarcity problems, even technological assistance to help them develop more efficient resource utilization. But they consistently refused our offers in favor of taking what they wanted through force. Dr. Hawthorne absorbed this information with growing horror. How did you stop them? Did the collective develop military capabilities? The question hung in the air for a long moment, and Kane noticed that all three aliens seemed to recoil slightly from the very concept of military action. We didn't stop them, HFY answered finally. They stopped themselves. The Rakshari and Vorthak eventually encountered each other during their respective expansion phases. Neither species could resist what they perceived as the ultimate challenge. A truly worthy opponent that could provide the kind of conflict and conquest that gave their existence meaning. Commander Fletcher's expression grew grim. They fought each other? They wiped each other out in a war that lasted 3 centuries and consumed entire star systems, Veltar confirmed. By the time their conflict ended, both species had destroyed themselves so thoroughly that we found only dead worlds and the scattered remains of once mighty civilizations. Kane felt his mouth go dry as the implications sank in. And the third species? The Zealand Imperium lasted the longest, nearly 2,000 orbital cycles. They were subtly dangerous in ways that took us far too long to recognize, HFY replied, its patterns now showing what Dr. Hawthorne suspected was a combination of fear and deep regret. Masters of manipulation and gradual conquest. They would offer technological aid to developing civilizations, establish mutually beneficial trade relationships, gradually make entire species economically and technologically dependent on their systems. The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications. Finally, Kane found his voice. Economic conquest rather than military? By the time their subject species realized they had become slaves, resistance was impossible. Their economies were integrated, their technologies dependent on Zealand systems, their very survival tied to continued cooperation with their conquerors. Dr. Hawthorne's voice was barely a whisper. What happened to them? They grew too confident, expanded too quickly across too many sectors. Eventually, they encountered something they couldn't manipulate, couldn't conquer, couldn't control. A stellar phenomenon that their science couldn't predict or contain. Their core worlds were consumed by a quantum cascade they had accidentally triggered while experimenting with space-time manipulation for faster-than-light communication. The room fell into a profound silence as the full weight of galactic history settled over everyone present. Finally, Kane found the courage to ask the question that hung in the air like a death sentence. And you think humans are like these species? HFY's response came without hesitation, delivered with the certainty of species that had learned to recognize danger through bitter experience. Your physiological responses to the scent of blood, the way your pupils dilated in response to stress, your unconscious postural shifts toward combat readiness. These are the exact markers we have learned to identify. The signs of a predator species that has retained its hunting instincts while gaining technological sophistication sufficient for interstellar expansion. Dr. Hawthorne looked stricken. But we're not like that. Humanity has moved beyond simple predation. We have art, philosophy, ethics, moral frameworks that govern our behavior. As did they, Veltar replied with profound sadness. All 3 species showed remarkable cultural achievements that rivaled our own. The Rakshari created music that could induce transcendent states of consciousness in multiple species. The Vorthak's poetry was considered among the finest artistic expression in the galaxy. The Zealand produced philosophical works that challenged our fundamental understanding of existence, consciousness, and the nature of reality itself. Commander Fletcher's voice was carefully controlled, each word measured. You're saying that cultural achievement doesn't matter? That we're automatically dangerous because of our evolutionary background, regardless of how far we've progressed? We are saying, HFY replied with the weight of 8,000 years of galactic history behind its words, that intelligence does not eliminate the predator's nature. It merely makes it more sophisticated, more dangerous, and ultimately more destructive. The revelation hit the bridge crew like a shockwave. Captain Kane stood motionless as the implications of HFY's words sank in. The collective has been monitoring this first contact, the Etherean continued. Our ships maintain constant communication through quantum entanglement networks. The moment your predatory responses were confirmed, protocols established after the Zealand Imperium incident were automatically initiated. Dr. Hawthorne's face went pale. What protocols? Immediate containment and evaluation, Veltar replied. It's for arms moving in what Kane was beginning to recognize as agitation. Your species' location, technological capabilities, and expansion potential have been assessed. The Collective Council is already in session. Commander Fletcher stepped forward, his hand unconsciously moving toward his sidearm before he caught himself. The gesture didn't go unnoticed by the aliens, whose skin patterns flared with renewed alarm. You're talking about a preemptive strike, Fletcher said, his voice deadly quiet. We prefer the term preventive stabilization, HFY replied. The collective has learned that waiting only allows predator species to grow stronger, more dangerous. The quantum cascade that destroyed the Zealand Imperium was an accident, but it showed us that advanced predator species will eventually develop weapons capable of threatening entire star systems. Kane felt something shifting inside him, not the earlier physiological response to blood, but something deeper, older. The recognition of a threat to his pack, his species, his family back on Earth. How long do we have? He asked. The Council's decision will be reached within 1 standard day, HFY answered. If the vote is for stabilization, a containment fleet will be dispatched to your solar system. All human colonies will be pacified, and your species will be relocated to a quarantine world where you can live peacefully without access to interstellar technology. Dr. Hawthorne's scientific mind grappled with the enormity of it. You're talking about the imprisonment of an entire species based on biological determinism. What about free will? What about the possibility that we might be different? Every predator species believes it is different, Veltar replied sadly. The Rakshari spoke of honor. The Vortak claimed they sought only justice for past wrongs. The Zealand insisted they were bringing order to chaos. All maintained that their actions were justified, even necessary. Kane walked to the viewport, staring out at the stars that suddenly seemed far more hostile than they had mere hours ago. Behind him, he could hear the subtle sounds of his crew. The breathing, the slight movements, the barely audible humming of human activity that had seemed so normal before. There's something you haven't considered, he said finally, turning back to face the Ethereans. What is that, Captain Kane? HFY asked. Kane's pupils dilated slightly, not from the scent of blood this time, but from the cold calculation of a cornered predator facing overwhelming odds. The aliens noticed immediately, their skin patterns shifting to deeper alarm configurations. You've told me that in 8,000 years, you've contacted over 300 species. 3 were predatory, and all 3 eventually became threats to the collective. Correct, HFY confirmed. But here's what you missed, Kane continued, his voice carrying a new edge. Those 3 species didn't know they were being evaluated. They didn't know about the collective's history with predator species. They didn't know that their first contact was actually a test they could fail. Dr. Hawthorne caught on immediately. But we do know. Exactly, Kane said, his gaze never leaving the aliens. For the first time in your collective's history, you're dealing with a predator species that knows it's being hunted. The silence that followed was profound. Commander Fletcher slowly smiled, an expression that made the aliens recoil further. You've made an assumption, Kane continued. You assumed that because we retain predator instincts, we're automatically a threat. But predators are also capable of something you've apparently never encountered. What is that? HFY whispered. Kane's smile matched his security chief's, and in that moment, the Ethereans saw something that would haunt their dreams for cycles to come. The look of a cornered predator who had just realized it wasn't as cornered as its hunters believed. Adaptation, Kane replied. We don't just react to threats. We evolve to overcome them. And now, thanks to this conversation, we know exactly what threat we're facing. The conference room's lighting seemed to dim as the implications settled over everyone present. The collective had spent 8,000 years perfecting their response to predator species, but they had never faced one that knew the game was being played. The council will still make its decision, HFY said, but uncertainty colored its bioluminescent patterns for the first time. Yes, Kane agreed, but now they'll be making it about a species that's had advance warning. A species that knows about quantum entanglement communication networks, collective protocols, and the location of at least one collective evaluation team. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Tell me, Counselor HFY, in your 8,000 years of experience, what do cornered predators typically do when they realize they're being hunted? The alien's response came in frequencies so high that the translator could barely process them, but the meaning was clear to everyone in the room. For the first time in their species' history, the Ethereans were the ones experiencing the fear of being prey. And somewhere in the depths of space, humanity's real test was just beginning.